All right, so a telltale way to identify a hard light source is the drop shadows. So obviously, like right up in here, you see the sharpness of the edge of the shadow. So I'm actually gonna go back. So you see how like defined this shadow is? That's like the immediate telltale for me on if the light source is hard or soft. I mean, the other aspect that I could pay attention to is like in her T zone. So I'm looking in this area right here and I'm wondering how hard her highlights are punching. And then you can kind of see if I change colors really quickly, how like in these areas, on the other hand, it starts to be a lot darker. So there's this mix of there being this highlight area that's in her T zone, right? And then there's this shadowed area that ends up being outside of that T zone. So it's darker here, darker here, darker here, and then, like I said, darker here. That kind of shows up in other areas of her body as well. So if you start to look at the collarbone area, you'll start to see how the light hits here but doesn't hit here. It hits here but doesn't hit here, right? And all of those things are indicative of me kind of identifying that this is a harder light source or a more harsh light source. Even kind of seeing how clearly defined the line is for the fall off. So everything down here is just completely black. It goes across here. This is a bit more of it's a focusing spot. So because of it being a focusing spot, that fall off is a lot more dramatic than if it was just a general hard light source. Because that general hard light source doesn't necessarily have to have such defined edges to it the way that this does on the bottom. It doesn't have to have these same kind of defined edges the way that this does on the bottom, but it will have some type of harsh shadows or strong shadows. I shouldn't say harsh because it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it will have some sort of like definition to where the shadows show up, like in here. In contrast, this is an example where you could look in that same area up under the neck and that light doesn't have that same kind of harsh or more defined edge to it. Even in those areas where I was talking about how it has the highlights and the shadows, they're still there, but they're just not as punchy as they are when the light source is a bit more hard. And then going back even still to the T-zone area. So if I were to look at her T-zone area, it's like there's still a highlight in the T-zone for sure. But the variation between that highlight area and that shadow area isn't as drastic or isn't as defined as it is when the light source is a lot more hard or punchy. And using a punchy or hard light source is something I do in a lot of beauty work. So you'll see that under here, you can see that defined shadow under the neck. And then even on that background, you can see the drop shadow that hits that background is really, really defined as well. I see it all over here, right? And then we even see it down in here where it gets like to be darker on this area, but then everything that's up above that, that's in the kind of zone of where the light hits, is all bright. It's not something that's even exclusively used for just single faces, right? So this is another one where we go back, same light source that was used on that single image is being used for these three ladies, where you still see the definition showing up on the wall from that drop shadow. Even under the arm, there's this really defined shadow up under here as well, right? And what it does is it just kind of gives a vibrance or a punchiness to the overall image, but that looks, in my opinion, really beautiful. It brings out some of the sheen in the hair so that the hair looks vibrant. And then also it does a great job of giving you these really kind of punchy catch lights in the eyes. And this isn't a technique that's exclusive to just beauty images. I mean, again, there's another scenario where you very clearly see the defined drop shadow from that really kind of crisp, hard light source that I'm using to illuminate this entire set. Even on the flowers over here, you can see that defined shadow showing up on here. So the real conversation is how you achieve it. So let's look at this image really quickly. Most people would have something like this. This is a focusing spot or a Fresnel. This in particular is a Fresnel. Fresnel. But it's pronounced Fresnel, or at least that's how I've pronounced it over the years. Nobody's ever really kind of corrected me. But if you go Googling, you're looking for a focusing spot or a snoot that has a Fresnel lens in there. And what it allows you to do is it creates these very defined shadows. So as you can see, just even on the modeling light, it shows how there's this focus light on our model. And then actually, if you even look back at the back wall back here, you could see where that actual, like literally, this is her nose. All right, that's her brow. It's so defined that in this environment, it'll essentially kind of shape to cut her out, and then everything else around her is all in the dark. This is usually where everybody stops at, and then your picture will look a little bit like this. The caveat or the hustle or the way that I approach it is that you have to add a little bit more light. So what I would normally do is in the same environment, while this is my key light, and it just so happens that in my studio, all the walls around are white, what I would do is take a secondary light and point that secondary light like straight up into the ceiling. Or if I'm the photographer right here, right? So let's say that let's choose a different color. Let's say that I'm the photographer right here, right? You can see my camera. I would actually take another light and point it towards the wall behind me. So there's a light source that's just a bare bulb or something like that that I'm pointing at the wall. Actually, let me do that differently. So I'm not going to erase any of this. Excuse me, I'm not going to delete any of this, but I'm just going to change up where it's placed so that we can make sure I have proper context. So I'm still going to take a light and I'm going to point that light at the wall behind me, but instead of me having it that low, I'm actually saying like I would be all the way up here with it. So I would have a light source that was pointed up into the corner up here that was just bare bulbed. So what it would do is I have my key light that was creating this defined shape around her. And then I would have another light source that was at maybe half power, and I would have it just bouncing into a back wall somewhere, as long as that wall was white or was like a neutral color. Whatever the case is, it'll give you this result. Now, once I have that light on and the power output leaves me with this result, it's too much because it kind of takes some of the characteristics away from the focusing spot that I'm trying to get. So all I got to do is just dial down that light and then I'll get a result like this. All right, so just to make sure that we kind of level set, these are the three images. The first image has just the key light, which is that focusing spot. The second or the middle image is now I'm adding in a fill light. I left the key light exactly where it was, and I had that fill light bouncing off of a wall that was behind me while I was taking our picture. And then the third image, or the image far to the right, was essentially me just dialing down that fill light, still never adjusting my key light on any of these. You can even see the exposure on her doesn't change very much because that fill light is actually coming in at a power that's lower than my key light. And I mean, that might just be some game right there that you need to catch, right? My fill light is low enough that it can actually flash and not have an effect on my key light because my key light is so punchy and so powerful that it dominates the overall exposure. Here are some examples of me using this exact lighting setup for a cosmetic campaign. And if you find breakdowns of lighting setups like this interesting, you should really check out my lighting recipe guide. It's a step-by-step book that basically shows you how to recreate some of my favorite lighting setups in the studio. I'll show you the setup, I'll show you the lighting I used, I'll tell you where to place it at, and I'll tell you what to look for once you've made your placements. You can find out more information about it in the description of this video. Peace.